Of all the things we value as Americans, there may be nothing more important to us than our freedom. Our nation was founded on the very idea of freedom. Freedom from tyranny, freedom from oppression. Our discourse among each other today in society, and more often than not our discord, is based upon fighting to push our respective views of what freedom is and what freedom is not. We uphold democracy as another one of our great values. All men are created equal, as our Declaration of Independence states. And so each one of us has a voice. Each one of us has a say in building up the future that we hope to see. Yet here we are in church this morning, celebrating the solemnity of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of the universe. I don't know about you, but kingship seems to be a bit contradictory to our American sensibilities. The king is seen as a symbol of power and control. He's seen as the arbiter of the freedoms of the people. The king cannot be removed or voted out of office. The authority of the king is absolute. So how do we reconcile all of this? How are we to make sense of the kingship of Christ if kingship goes against so much of what we value as Americans? Well, I think we first need to look at the conversation that Jesus has with Pilate in the gospel today. Pontius Pilate asked Jesus what seems like a simple yes or no question. He says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Though Jesus affirms his kingly identity when he says, "My kingdom does not belong to this world," Pilate is left a bit more confused. He didn't get the yes or no he was looking for. So is he a king or is he not a king? Jesus' next response to Pilate tells us a lot when he says, "You say that I am a king." See, there's a problem from the beginning of this conversation. Pilate and Jesus are not seeing kingship from the same perspective. Pilate assumes that if Jesus is king, he must possess all the normal things that kings would have. He would have authority and control over his subjects. He would have political and social power. He would have land and he would have armies. But as we know, Jesus doesn't have any of these, at least not in the conventional sense. As Christians, we have to get used to Jesus subverting our expectations. And this is no exception. When Pilate says the word king, and when Jesus says the word king, they mean two very different things. Because their view of kingship is ultimately opposed to each other. So what does Jesus' kingship look like? It looks like him taking on human flesh at the incarnation. It looks like healing the sick and casting out demons and forgiving sins. It looks like dying on the cross for our redemption. It looks like coming to us each and every Mass in the most holy sacrament of the Eucharist. It looks like being with us always, as he promised to the disciples and he promises to us. See, the kingship of Christ is not the same as the kingship of a tyrant. It is not built on political authority or power or oppression or violence or fear. Rather, the kingship of Christ is built on humility, meekness, and poverty, and love. But as much as we may fear the tyrant king, the kingship of Christ may actually be more intimidating to us. Of course, we don't like the tyrant king because he's demanding, he's unjust, he's cruel, even evil at times. But in our sinfulness, we may actually prefer the tyrant king to the kingship of Christ, because the kingship of Christ challenges us to conversion. It's easy enough to look at the tyrant king and see all of his flaws and all of his evil ways and recognize all those places that he needs to change. But if we look at Christ the King, we are ultimately confronted with the places that we need to change. The kingship of Christ calls us to move beyond our own selfish desires and to live authentically for the good of others. The kingship of Christ challenges us to follow his example, ultimately to the point of taking up our own cross. The kingship of Christ forces us to reflect on our thoughts and our actions and to seek forgiveness for the wrong that we have done. The kingship of Christ moves us towards renouncing sin and living in freedom and holiness of life. But these are hard things to do because it's hard to change. It's hard to be open to a new possibility of life if we haven't been living it fully yet. Jesus destroyed the kingdom of death here on earth. Through his death, he conquered death and opened up the kingdom of heaven to all of us. Christ the King is the King of the universe. His dominion is everywhere. But there's still one last battle going on in his kingdom. There are still lands, so to say, that have not yet been won for Christ. The one place where Jesus still desires to reign is in your heart. He desires to reign in our hearts so that he can help us to follow his example. Jesus wants to enter in and reign in the places of our hearts that are dark, that are messy, that are full of pain, full of sin. Christ the King wants to conquer those places where sin still has a hold on us so that we may become free. And we all have those places in our hearts. But this can only happen if we allow Christ to reign in our hearts. As Pope Benedict XVI said, "The feast of Christ the King is not a feast of those who are subjugated, but a feast of those who know they are in the hands of the one who writes straight on crooked lines." See, Jesus wants to reign in our hearts so that the weakness of our sinfulness may be transformed into the strength of holiness. It is Christ the King who will establish his reign in the places of our hearts that are dark, that are messy, that are full of pain, so that he may bring about a glorious transformation. But this can only happen if we let Christ reign in our hearts. And this is the paradox of the kingship of Christ. What greater authority can there be than the humility of Christ? What greater power can there be than the meekness of Christ? What greater wealth could a king have than the wealth of poverty? What greater freedom could we have than living under the reign of Christ the King? What greater joy could we find than in following the example of the kingship of Christ? The feast of Christ the King is not a feast of those who are subjugated, but a feast of those who are actually the freest of all. And so if you desire this freedom, then invite the King in. Allow him to reign in your heart, in those places of darkness, in those places of pain and sin, so that he can bring about healing and transformation, so that through the very witness of our lives, all may come to know and believe that Jesus Christ is King.